All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD, or Application and Website Development Program, and in particular the AWD 1111.NET Framework with Web Databases class, I've been creating a series of video presentations for the AWD 1111 class for the fall 2019 semester, based on the book we'll be using, which is the one shown on screen right now, Pro ASP.NET MVC 5. This is an A-Press text by Mr. Adam Freeman. And I am now, I believe, in Chapter 17 on controllers and actions. And I'm working my way through there. So I am up to page 459. And on page 459, we are going to talk about understanding how parameter objects are instantiated. And as the author mentions right here, the base controller class obtains values for action method parameters using MVC framework components called value providers and model providers. Model providers are part of the model binders, and they will be discussed in much more depth and breadth of coverage when we get to Chapter 24. All right. So, understanding optional and compulsory parameters. In the MVC framework, if the MVC framework cannot find a value for a reference parameter, the action method will still be called, but will be called using a null value for that parameter. If a value cannot be found for a value type parameter, then an exception will be thrown, and the action method will not be called. Another way of thinking about it, value type parameters are compulsory. So in other words, to make them optional, either specify a default value or change the parameter type to allow a nullable, typically with a question mark on the end. So the MVC so that the MVC framework can pass null if no value is available. Whereas reference type parameters are optional. If you want to make them compulsory, all right, add some code to the top of the action method to reject null values. Okay, specifying default parameters, bottom of page 459. If you want to process requests that do not contain values for action method parameters, but you would rather not check for nulls, you can use the C# optional parameters feature instead. And there's an example right here. All right, as you take a look at it. You mark parameters as optional by assigning values when you define them. The MVC framework will then try to obtain the values from the request for these parameters, and if they're not available, the default specified will be used. For the string one that's right there, this means that I do not need to check for null values if the request I am processing didn't specify a value. Then it'll be called with the string all. For the int parameter, we don't need to worry about requests resulting in errors. All right, the method will be called with a default value of 1. Optional parameters can be used for literal types, which are types you can define without using the new keyword, things like string, int, double, etc. There's a cautionary note here near the top of page 460 where the author says if the request does contain a value for the parameter, but it cannot be converted to the correct type, the framework will pass the default value for that parameter type and will register the attempted value as a validation error in a special object called model state. We've looked at model state in the past with the isValid method. All right, producing output, bottom half of page 460. After a controller is finished processing a request, it usually needs to generate a response. Makes sense. When we created the bare metal controller by implementing the iController interface directly, we needed to take the responsibility for every aspect of processing the request, including generating the response to the client. If we want to send an HTML response, for example, we must create and assemble the HTML data and send it to the client using the response.write method. Both of these approaches are shown as it says there in figure 17.7, which shows enhancements to our controller class. Well, let's just grab everything. This is our basic controllers class. Hopefully we have that. There it is. All right, there's the first part. As always, we'll probably get errors. That's fine. Here is the second part. All right. And the author mentions here, you can see you can use the same approach when you have derived your controller from the controller class. The HTTP response base class that is returned when you read the request context.http context.response property is available through the controller.response property. All right. So we can go into the derived controller class, and they show this in the middle of page 461. All right. And then down at the bottom, after our action result, we can go and add this. This produce output method uses the value of the server.machineName property to decide what response to send to the client. This approach works, but as the author mentions on the bottom of page 461 and the top of page 462, it's not without its problems. First, the controller classes must contain details of HTML or URL structures, which again kind of breaks that separation of concerns. Second, it is hard to unit test a controller that generates its response directly to the output. Third, handling the fine detail of every response this way is tedious and it can result in being error prone. Fortunately, the MVC framework has a feature that addresses all of these issues. That feature, which we'll discuss next, is known as action results. All right. 8 minutes, so we're good. All right, near the top of page 462, as mentioned here, the MVC framework uses action results to separate stating intentions from executing intentions. The concept is simple once you have mastered it, but it takes a while to get your head around the approach at first. Rather than working directly with the response object, action methods return an object derived from the action result class that describes what the response from the controller will be, such as rendering a view or redirecting to another URL. Right here, when the MVC framework receives an action result object from an action method, it calls the execute result method defined by that object. The action result implementation then deals with the response object for you. It generates the output that corresponds to your intention. To demonstrate how this works, the author has created an infrastructure folder. So let's do that. Not one here. Okay. And we're supposed to add a new class to this called Custom Direct Result. I'm sorry. Custom Redirect Result. right. And we are asked to put in this code down toward the bottom of page, toward the bottom of page 462. The author has set up the class this way, and it says, I base the class on the way that the system.web.mvc.redirectResult works. One of the benefits of using the MVC framework, and one of the benefits of it being open source, is you can actually bring up the code and see how things work. All right. When we generate an instance of the redirect result class, we pass in the URL we want to redirect the user to. The execute result method, which will be executed by the MVC framework when the action method is finished, gets the response object for the query through the controller context object that the framework provides, and then calls the redirect method. Okay, it says this is exactly what I'm going to do in the bare bones iController implementation in 17.7-7. All right. In order to kind of check this out, so to speak, okay, I'm in figure 1710 on page 463. So we've got to go to our derived controller, and where we've got our produce output right here, we want to change that to an action result. We're going to get some errors in here for a lot of reasons. All right, so there's the action result, produce output. All right, we're getting that error now because we're not returning that. So if it's tiny, we don't want to do this anymore. We want to now, in fact, let's just comment that out. And we will return new custom redirect result URL equals basic index. Public action result, produce output, and otherwise response write controller, derived action produce output, etc. Hit enter here and return null. All right, that removes that error, and here we need that using statement up here. Yes, we do. Okay. The author says, notice I had to change the result of the action method to action result. And also, because we're returning something here, we return null if we do not want the MVC framework to do anything. On the bottom half of page 463 is a unit test, which again, we're not doing those. So I'm just going to move on. I am at 14.5 minutes. Seems like a pretty good place to stop. All right, and we'll pick it up here then in the next lesson.